I hired a cleaning lady to check on my son's house while he and his wife were away on a ski trip in Aspen. An hour later, she called me, her voice trembling so hard I could barely understand her words. "Sir," she whispered, "there is someone crying in the attic. It is not the television. It is a human being." I rushed over, broke down a heavy industrial padlock, and found out exactly what they had been hiding in the freezing dark. My blood began to boil. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth or betrayed your trust. My name is Richard Caldwell, though everyone just calls me Rick. I am 70 years old, a retired chief engineer and building contractor who spent 4 decades building skyscrapers and luxury complexes right here in Chicago. I am a practical man. I deal in steel concrete and cold, hard facts. I do not panic easily, and I have seen enough of the world to know that people lie. But when Maria called me that Tuesday morning, the sheer terror in her voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Maria is a hardworking, honest immigrant woman I have known and employed for years. I had asked her to go over to the Lincoln Park neighborhood to do a deep clean on my son Bradley's house while he and his wife Monica were vacationing in Colorado. It was supposed to be a routine job, just dusting and polishing to keep the place looking perfect. But her phone call shattered my reality. "Mr. Caldwell." "Please come quick," she pleaded, sobbing into the receiver. I was dusting the second-floor hallway, and I heard it, a moaning sound. Someone is up there in the attic. They are crying. I told her to step outside immediately, lock her car doors, and wait for me on the street. I did not bother with a winter coat. I just grabbed my truck keys and drove like a madman from my quiet place in the suburbs straight into the busy heart of the city. My son Bradley is 34 years old. He is a hotshot finance executive who projects an image of absolute perfection. His wife, Monica, is 32, a former interior design model whose entire life revolves around social status, expensive dinners, and showing off her luxury lifestyle on the internet. I helped them buy this house. I handed over a $500,000 down payment from my life savings because I wanted my son to have his dream home. Now, my tires were screeching to a halt in the driveway of that very same dream home, and my stomach was tied in absolute knots. Maria was trembling on the icy sidewalk when I pulled up. I told her she did the right thing, handed her a full day of pay, and sent her home so she would not be involved in whatever I was about to find. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The first floor was immaculate. White marble floors, imported Italian leather sofas, a custom chef's kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It was a monument to their wealth, entirely funded by my decades of hard labor. But as I climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, the silence of the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. I walked past their pristine master bedroom and reached the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. I stood there holding my breath, listening to the absolute stillness of the house. And then I heard it. A low, agonizing whimper. It was a sound of absolute broken despair vibrating through the ceiling panels. I rushed up the narrow wooden steps to the attic door. I reached for the brass knob, but it would not budge. I looked closer and felt a sudden surge of pure confusion and mounting anger. There, bolted right into the solid oak frame of the door, was a heavy-duty industrial-grade steel padlock. You do not put a lock like that on an attic door in a luxury residential home, unless you are trying to keep something or someone permanently locked inside. As an old building contractor, I never travel anywhere without my tools. I ran back down the stairs, went straight out to my truck, and grabbed my heavy steel bolt cutters from the toolbox in the back. Walking back through that luxurious, pristine house with a massive pair of industrial cutters in my hands, I kept muttering to myself, $500,000. I gave my own flesh and blood a $500,000 down payment for this place, and they turned the top floor into a prison. I marched back up the narrow steps to the attic door. I clamped the steel jaws of the bolt cutters around the thick shackle of the padlock and squeezed with every ounce of strength left in my 70-year-old arms. The steel groaned, resisting for a moment, and then snapped with a loud, echoing crack. The heavy lock hit the wooden floorboards. I shoved the door open. The moment the door swung wide, a blast of freezing winter air hit me in the face, carrying a stench so foul, so heavy with decay and human waste that my eyes immediately began to water. I had to pull my shirt up over my nose just to breathe. The attic was completely unheated. In the dead of a Chicago winter, the temperature up there was barely above freezing. There was no proper lighting, only the dim gray rays struggling through a small, frosted ventilation window. I reached out blindly and flicked the light switch on the wall. A single bare bulb flickered to life, illuminating the darkest, coldest corner of the room. My heart shattered into a million pieces, and all the air left my lungs. Huddled on a filthy, heavily stained mattress on the bare floor was Leo. Leo is Monica's younger brother. He is 28 years old and suffers from severe nonverbal autism. I had not seen him in nearly a year. The young man looking back at me was practically a skeleton. He was wearing a thin, ragged t-shirt, shivering violently. His lips turned a pale, sickly blue from the freezing cold. Beside him was a plastic bucket that had clearly been used as a toilet, surrounded by a couple of empty, crushed water bottles. But that was not the worst part. The worst part, the detail that made my blood run absolutely cold, was the thick metal chain wrapped tightly around his ankle, securing him directly to a heavy wooden support beam in the wall. I fell to my knees beside the mattress. "Leo," I whispered, my voice breaking. He flinched violently, pulling his knees tightly to his chest, terrified of me, terrified of everything. I looked at his wrists and ankles. They were raw, covered in deep purple scars that indicated he had been fighting those restraints for a very, very long time. I quickly took off my heavy flannel shirt and wrapped it around his shaking, emaciated shoulders. My mind was spinning, trying to process the sheer horror of what I was witnessing, trying to reconcile the successful son I thought I knew with the monster who had engineered this room. Just 10 months ago, Bradley and Monica had come to my house crying and desperate, saying they needed financial help. They told me that Leo's care had become too much for them to handle at home. They begged me for the $500,000, swearing to me, looking me dead in the eyes, that they were using my money to secure a lifetime spot for Leo in a premier specialized medical care facility in Switzerland. They told me it was the only place in the world that could give him the professional care and the beautiful life he truly deserved. I had written the check willingly. I had hugged my son, feeling so proud of him for taking such incredible, selfless care of his disabled brother-in-law. I believed them completely. I believed I was funding a safe, beautiful life for a vulnerable young man. Instead, my money had bought the very house where they were torturing him. My son, my own flesh and blood, had left this helpless boy, chained like an animal, in a freezing attic, to die in his own filth, all while he and his wife were sipping expensive champagne on the snowy, luxurious slopes of Aspen. I knelt there in the freezing dirt, holding a terrified, starving boy, and I felt something shift deep inside my chest. The loving, generous, forgiving father died in that attic. What took his place was a man who was ready to burn their entire empire to the ground. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. I dialed my son's number, entirely prepared to listen to exactly what kind of lie he would spin, and entirely prepared to make him pay for every second of this nightmare. I pulled up my recent contacts and pressed the button for my son. The phone began to ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. With every second that passed, the icy air of that attic seemed to cut deeper into my bones. I looked down at Leo, who was shivering beneath my flannel shirt, his eyes darting frantically around the dim room. Finally, the line clicked open. Immediately, a wave of loud thumping bass and the overlapping chatter of a crowded room flooded the earpiece. I could hear glasses clinking and someone shouting a cheer in the background. It was the undeniable sound of an expensive, carefree vacation in Aspen. Then Bradley's voice cut through the noise, loud and cheerful. "Hey, Dad, what a surprise. We are just at the lodge grabbing some drinks after hitting the slopes. Is everything all right back home? You usually do not call in the middle of the day." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sheer contrast between his luxurious reality and the freezing, foul-smelling prison I was currently standing in made my vision blur with anger. I did not bother with pleasantries. I did not even say hello. "Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "I am standing in your house right now. I am standing on the second floor. And I am looking at a broken industrial padlock on the floor of your hallway. Do you want to tell me what I just found in your attic?" The background noise on the other end of the line seemed to vanish instantly. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but dead silence. I could hear the faint sound of Bradley breathing the sudden sharp intake of air as his brain desperately tried to process how his carefully constructed secret had just collapsed. I waited for the panic. I waited for the stuttering excuses, but my son is a finance executive. He makes a living out of spinning disasters into opportunities. When he finally spoke, the cheerful vacationer was completely gone. In his place was a broken, exhausted caregiver. His voice trembled thick with sudden tears. "Dad," he whispered, sounding utterly defeated. "Dad, please. I can explain. Please, just listen to me before you do anything." I stayed silent, letting him hang in the void. He took a ragged breath and launched into his story. "We tried, Dad. We really tried. The facility in Switzerland, the one we used your money to secure for him. It shut down unexpectedly 3 months ago. There was a massive legal issue with their licensing, and the government closed them down overnight. We had absolutely no choice. We had to fly over there and bring Leo back home immediately. We were going to tell you, I swear we were. But we were just so ashamed that your money went to waste, and we did not want to burden you with our problems." He paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sob. It was a masterful performance. If I had not spent 40 years in the construction business negotiating with liars and cheats, I might have actually believed him. I asked him why Monica's brother was chained to a floor beam like a feral animal. Bradley's voice cracked perfectly on cue. "Dad, you do not understand how bad his condition has gotten. When the clinic shut down, the sudden change in routine broke him. He became incredibly violent. He was having severe episodes, throwing himself against the walls, breaking glass, trying to tear his own hair out. The doctors told us he was a danger to himself and to us. We tried keeping him in the guest room, but he would destroy everything and hurt himself with the broken pieces. The only time he ever calmed down, the only time he stopped hurting himself, was when we put him in a dark, confined space. The attic was the only place he felt safe. We did not chain him up to be cruel, Dad. We did it to keep him from breaking his own bones during his violent fits." I looked down at the boy on the mattress. Leo was barely skin and bones. He did not look like a danger to anyone. He looked like a stiff breeze could break him in half. "And what about the cold, Bradley?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "It is freezing up here. There is no heat." He is wearing a thin shirt. "Dad, we hired a private nurse," Bradley said quickly, his words rushing out in a desperate flood. "We hired a professional caregiver to be with him 24 hours a day while we went on this trip. We paid her an absolute fortune to make sure the space heaters were running, to feed him hot meals, and to give him his medication. She must have just stepped out to pick up a prescription. I swear to you, Dad, she is supposed to be there right now. Please tell me you did not call the police." "Dad, you cannot call the police. If they see him like this, if they do not understand his specific medical needs, they will take him away. The state will throw him into a public psychiatric ward. Those places are horrific, Dad. They will strap him to a bed and drug him into a coma. You have to wait for us. We will book the next flight out of Aspen and come straight home. Please, Dad, do not let the state take him." I stood there in the freezing dirt of the attic, holding the phone to my ear, listening to my son plead for his life. I looked down at my feet. Resting on the floorboards was the heavy industrial padlock I had just cut. A massive block of solid steel designed for shipping containers. I looked at the thick metal chain wrapping around Leo's scarred ankle. I thought about the nurse Bradley claimed to have hired. A private medical professional running out to a pharmacy does not lock a severely autistic patient in an unheated attic from the outside using a heavy-duty master padlock. A nurse does not leave a human being to freeze in their own filth. The entire story was an incredibly well-constructed, plausible lie. It was designed to play on my sympathy, to make me doubt what I was seeing with my own two eyes, and to buy them time. They needed time, and they needed me to stay quiet. My immediate instinct was to roar into the phone to tell him I was calling the federal authorities, to tell him he was going to rot in a prison cell for what he had done to this innocent boy. My blood was screaming for immediate justice, but a cold, calculating realization washed over me. If I called the police right now, Bradley and Monica would know the game was over. They had money. They had resources. With one phone call, they could transfer their assets offshore, hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys, and tie this situation up in court for years. They might even try to spin the narrative and blame the imaginary nurse entirely. I needed actual evidence. I needed to understand the true scope of this betrayal before I blew it all up. I had to play the game. I had to be exactly what they thought I was, a gullible, overly trusting old man. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to sound shaky and uncertain. I let out a long, weary sigh into the receiver. "Okay, Brad," I said, making sure I sounded thoroughly exhausted and overwhelmed by the situation. "Okay, I hear you. I understand. It is just such a shock finding him like this. I was so worried. But I hear what you are saying about the state hospitals. I will not call the police. I will wait for you and Monica to get back. Just hurry home, please." I could almost hear the massive sigh of relief from the other end of the line. "Thank you, Dad," Bradley said, his voice instantly relaxing, the panic completely vanishing. "Thank you so much for understanding. You are a lifesaver. We are packing our bags right now. We will be home by tomorrow morning. Just leave the house and lock the front door. We will handle the nurse when we get back. I promise we will fix this." I told him I would see him tomorrow and ended the call. I lowered the phone and looked around the desolate, freezing room. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He truly believed he had manipulated me. He truly believed I was just going to walk away and let him clean up his mess. I knelt back down beside Leo, who was still clutching my flannel shirt for warmth. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "Do not worry, son," I whispered into the cold air. "We are not waiting for anyone." I carefully picked the young man up. He was unbelievably light, his emaciated frame feeling fragile against my chest. I carried him down the narrow attic stairs away from the freezing dark and down through the pristine, luxurious hallways of the house my money had built. I brought him out to my truck, settled him into the heated passenger seat, and buckled him in. I had told Bradley I was going to wait. I had swallowed my rage and played the part of the confused, compliant father perfectly. But the truth was, I was not going to sit around and wait for their excuses. The war had just begun, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them next. I kept the heater in my truck blasting as we drove away from that pristine nightmare of a house. Leo was huddled in the passenger seat, swallowed entirely by my heavy winter coat and 2 thick wool blankets I always kept in the back of my cab for emergencies. He did not speak. He barely even moved save for the violent shivers that racked his fragile frame every few minutes. I kept glancing over at him, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to reconcile the horrific reality sitting next to me with the polished lies my son had fed me over the phone. Bradley had begged me not to call the authorities. He had painted a terrifying picture of state-run wards and forced sedation playing on my protective instincts as a father and a grandfather. A part of me, the part that still desperately wanted to believe my son was fundamentally a good man, had agreed. But as a former building contractor, my entire career was based on structural integrity. I know when a foundation is rotten, and Bradley's story was built on sinking sand. I knew that if I called the police right then, a massive bureaucratic machine would swallow Leo whole before I even had a chance to uncover the truth. I needed an expert opinion, but I needed it entirely off the books. I pulled into the driveway of my own quiet suburban home and hurried around to the passenger side. I lifted Leo as gently as I could. He weighed practically nothing. I carried him inside, laid him down on the comfortable guest bed, and piled 3 more quilts on top of him. He curled into a tight fetal position, his eyes squeezed shut. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my phone. I scrolled past the emergency numbers and dialed an old friend I had known for over 30 years. Dr. Gregory Davis was a retired forensic medical examiner who used to consult on workplace injury claims for my construction firm. He was a man of absolute discretion, someone who had seen every dark corner of human cruelty and knew how to keep his mouth shut when the situation demanded it. He answered on the second ring. "Gregor," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I have a medical emergency at my house. I cannot call an ambulance and I cannot take him to an emergency room. I need you here right now, and I need you to bring your medical bag." Gregory did not ask any pointless questions. He simply asked for my address and hung up the phone. 20 minutes later, Gregory was walking through my front door. I led him straight to the guest bedroom. When he saw Leo, his professional composure faltered for a fraction of a second. A look of profound sorrow crossed his face, but he quickly masked it and went to work. He opened his worn leather bag, took out his stethoscope, and gently approached the bed. He spoke to Leo in a very soft, calming voice, moving with slow, deliberate gestures so he would not frighten the boy any further. I stood silently by the wooden door, watching in a heavy, suffocating silence as Gregory methodically conducted his medical examination. He carefully checked Leo's vitals, shined a small, bright penlight directly into his completely unresponsive eyes, and meticulously examined his stiff joints. Then he pulled back the thick blankets to look at Leo's wrists and ankles. I felt my stomach heave all over again. Without the dark, dim shadows of the attic hiding the details, the true extent of the physical damage was brutally clear. The skin around Leo's wrists was rubbed completely raw, but beneath the fresh abrasions were thick, raised bands of white scar tissue. Gregory spent a long time examining those scars, running his gloved fingers over the indented flesh. He checked the muscle mass in Leo's legs and gently pressed around his ribs, noting the severe lack of subcutaneous fat. After giving Leo a mild sedative to help him finally sleep, Gregory packed up his instruments and gestured for me to follow him into the living room. He poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen sink, took a long drink, and looked at me with an expression of grim certainty. "Rick," he said quietly, "whoever did this to this young man did not just start doing it." I looked at him, feeling a cold dread settling in my bones. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Bradley told me they just brought him back from Switzerland a few weeks ago. He said the violent episodes just started, that they only restrained him because he was a sudden danger to himself." Gregory shook his head slowly, a bitter, cynical smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That is a biological impossibility, Rick. I spent 30 years examining trauma. The human body tells a story that cannot be faked. Look at his muscle atrophy. You do not lose that much muscle mass in a few weeks of being confined. That level of wasting takes months of severe caloric restriction and complete lack of mobility. But the definitive proof is on his wrists and ankles." He pointed back toward the bedroom hallway. "Those ligature marks are not fresh. Yes, there is recent tearing and bleeding, but the scar tissue underneath is thick and highly developed. For scar tissue to form like that, the skin has to be broken, heal over and be broken again repeatedly over a massive span of time. Based on the density of those fibrous bands, I would stake my medical license that this boy has been chained to that floor for well over a year, maybe even 2. The room seemed to spin. Over a year. My son and daughter-in-law had looked me dead in the eyes 10 months ago, weeping fake tears, begging for $500,000 to send Leo to a premier Swiss clinic. They had taken my money, bought their luxury cars and imported furniture, and left this innocent disabled boy chained in an unheated attic right above their heads while they threw dinner parties and went on luxury ski vacations. It was not a sudden crisis. It was not a desperate medical measure. It was a calculated, systemic, and utterly ruthless cover-up. I looked at Gregory. "Will you stay with him?" I asked. "I need to go back to that house. I need to find out exactly what they have been doing with his life." Gregory nodded, taking a seat in the armchair near the hallway. "Take your time, Rick. He is safe here." I walked out of my house, my mind operating with a terrifying, absolute clarity. I was no longer a confused, heartbroken father trying to understand his child's mistake. I was a structural engineer looking at a condemned building, and I was going to tear it apart board by board until I found the rotten core. I got back into my truck and pointed the headlights toward the city. I was going to rip my son's perfect life completely wide open to the world today. I parked my truck away from the Lincoln Park house. The winter wind whipped the bare oak branches, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was focused on the task ahead. I unlocked the front door. The house was dead silent. The oppressive luxury disgusted me now. Every expensive painting and imported rug was stained with the cruelty I had found on the top floor. I walked straight into Bradley's home office. He had a massive mahogany desk, leather chairs, and shelves lined with unread business books. But I am a structural engineer and a master builder. I spent 40 years looking at blueprints, pouring concrete, and understanding exactly how buildings hide their secrets. Now standing in his office, I looked at the dimensions. I immediately noticed an 18-inch void unaccounted for in the architecture. I got down on my knees and examined the hardwood flooring near the custom-built bookshelves. Bradley was a finance guy, completely useless with his hands. But a contractor always leaves signs. I traced the grain of the expensive Brazilian walnut planks. I found a seam that did not align perfectly with the baseboard. I pulled a flathead screwdriver from my pocket and pried the board upward. It popped loose, revealing a heavy steel floor safe set deep into the concrete subfloor. I stared down at the dial of the heavy combination lock. Bradley thought he was incredibly clever. He thought he could hide his entire life behind a metal door, assuming his old man was too clueless to ever figure it out. He spent his days moving numbers on a screen, wearing suits that cost more than my first truck. But I built my life with my bare hands. I laid foundations in the freezing Chicago rain. I welded steel beams suspended 50 stories in the air. I walked back out to my truck and rummaged through my heavy steel toolbox. An angle grinder or a blowtorch would cause smoke noise and massive property damage. I needed to be entirely undetectable. I needed Bradley to walk into this house tomorrow, completely unaware that his fortress had been breached. I dug into a side compartment and pulled out a mechanic's stethoscope. I used to use it to listen to the internal vibrations of massive industrial generators. Today, I was going to use it to listen to the heartbeat of my son's deceit. I knelt beside the exposed cavity in the floor. I placed the earpieces into my ears and pressed the cold metal chest piece firmly against the steel plate of the safe right next to the dial. I placed my thick, scarred fingers on the cold metal dial and began to turn it slowly to the right. In the quiet of the room, the internal mechanics of the safe were amplified through the stethoscope. I heard the faint metallic scrape of the brass wheels rotating inside the casing. It is all about feeling the tension and listening for the drop. When a lock is engaged, the wheels spin freely until the driver pin catches the small indentation on the wheel. You just have to listen for that specific hollow click. I spun the dial past 0, moving with agonizing slowness. At 24, I heard a distinct heavy clack echo through the earpieces. I stopped. I reversed my motion, spinning the dial carefully to the left. My fingers adjusted to the microscopic resistance of the metal. I kept spinning, relying on decades of mechanical intuition. At 51, another solid drop echoed in my ears, 2 numbers down. I wiped a drop of sweat from my forehead. I turned the dial back to the right, moving even slower this time, waiting for the final tumbler to fall into place. The house was so quiet, I could hear the blood pumping through my own veins. I passed 70. I passed 80. Right at 87, the final tumbler clicked with a deeply satisfying thud. I grabbed the heavy steel handle, twisted it firmly to the right, and felt the massive locking bolts slide back. The heavy door groaned as I pulled it open. I pulled the stethoscope from my ears and looked down into the dark cavity of the floor safe. I expected to find medical dossiers for Leo, but the safe was entirely devoid of anything medical. There was not a single pill bottle or health insurance claim. Instead, the small steel compartment was packed tightly with thick manila folders and a black velvet box. I reached down and pulled out the first stack of documents. I opened the folder and began to read the crisp white pages under the warm glow of the desk lamp. They were bank statements, but they were not from any local branch in Illinois. They were massive consolidated statements from a private wealth management bank located in the Cayman Islands. I scanned the columns of numbers, my eyes darting across the pages. My breathing stopped entirely. The statements detailed a complex web of wire transfers, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore holdings. I picked up another folder and found the initial establishment papers for a private trust fund. I read the beneficiary name printed clearly at the top of the legal document. The trust belonged entirely to Leo. Monica's late parents had established a massive, multi-million-dollar trust to ensure their disabled son would be cared for unconditionally for the rest of his natural life. I dropped the papers onto the floor. The horrible, suffocating truth washed over me like freezing water. My son had not locked his brother-in-law in that attic because he was violent or unmanageable. He had not kept him in the freezing dark because a Swiss clinic had suddenly closed down. Bradley and Monica were intentionally keeping Leo hidden away barely alive on a filthy mattress so they could maintain absolute legal control as his guardians. They were systematically draining every single dollar of his inheritance to fund their luxurious, picture-perfect lifestyle. I reached back into the safe and picked up the small black velvet box. I popped the lid open. Resting on the dark fabric was a single encrypted titanium USB drive. I stared at the small metal device, knowing with absolute certainty that it contained the digital keys to their entire criminal operation. He was a ruthless, calculating monster who was torturing an innocent boy for money. I closed the safe, locked it tightly, and carefully put the floorboard back exactly as I found it. I slipped the USB drive and the offshore bank statements deep into my heavy jacket pocket. The time for being a confused, overly trusting father was completely over. I walked out of that immaculate home office with a cold, terrifying determination settling into my bones. I was going to use every piece of this hidden truth to utterly destroy the false, corrupt empire my son had built. I locked the front door behind me, stepped out into the freezing winter wind, and walked back to my truck. I needed to see exactly what was on that flash drive, and I needed to prepare for absolute war against my own son. The drive back to my house felt like moving through a thick, suffocating fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold fury radiating through my chest. The flashing streetlights of the city blurred past my windshield. My mind was consumed by the image of Leo shivering in the dark, chained to a floor beam like a discarded piece of furniture. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. The house was silent. Gregory was still inside, watching over the poor boy, who was finally experiencing his first moments of safety in over a year. I walked quietly through the front door, slipping past the guest bedroom to avoid waking them. I went straight into my home office and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, turned on my computer, and pulled the encrypted titanium flash drive from my jacket pocket. It felt unnaturally heavy in my palm, a small piece of metal holding the darkest secrets of my own blood. I plugged the drive into the port and waited for the screen to prompt me for a password. A sleek black prompt box appeared in the center of the monitor, demanding a security key. Bradley always thought he was the smartest person in any room, a corporate genius who could outmaneuver anyone. But as a father, you learn things about your children that they do not even realize they are broadcasting. Bradley was exceptionally arrogant, but he was also incredibly lazy and predictable. He relied on the same patterns he had used since high school. I tried his college fraternity letters combined with his graduation year. The screen flashed a red error message. I paused, resting my chin on my hand, thinking about his massive ego. I typed the name of his first finance firm, followed by his own birthday. Another red error. I closed my eyes, picturing the way he boasted about his newly purchased dream home. I slowly typed the street address of the Lincoln Park house, followed by the word capital. The red error message vanished. A green progress bar filled the screen, and the drive unlocked. I stared at the route directory, feeling a bitter sense of triumph. His ultimate security measure was nothing more than a monument to his own vanity. The drive contained dozens of neatly organized folders. They were labeled with financial jargon designed to look like standard corporate portfolios. Equity allocations, offshore disbursements, liquid asset management. I clicked on a master ledger file named Private Holdings. The document opened, revealing a sprawling spreadsheet of massive financial transactions. At the very top of the page, written in bold black letters, was the title of a specialized trust fund. It was listed as the Leo Montgomery Special Needs Trust. Beside the title was a principal balance figure that made me sit back in my chair. $3 million. I opened the accompanying legal documents attached to the file. They were the final will and testament of Monica's late parents. They had tragically passed away in a boating accident 4 years ago. The documents clearly detailed that their entire estate had been liquidated to fund a massive trust specifically designed to guarantee Leo lifelong premier medical care. The legal stipulations were crystal clear. The money was strictly designated for medical facilities, professional nursing staff, and specialized therapies. Bradley and Monica had simply been appointed as the primary legal custodians of the fund following her parents' death. I began scrolling through the withdrawal columns of the spreadsheet. The sheer volume of the theft was staggering. Every single month, Bradley had been drafting perfectly fabricated invoices for non-existent medical therapies and phantom psychiatric consultations. He was submitting these forged documents to the trust to legally justify massive withdrawals. The money would flow from the primary trust account into a secondary holding account, and from there, it would be dispersed into their personal offshore accounts. I opened a folder labeled Swiss Clinic Deposit. This was the money I had personally given them. The $500,000 I had handed over with a proud smile, believing I was saving Leo's life. The ledger showed my exact deposit amount entering their checking account on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the entire sum had been wired to a luxury maritime brokerage located in the British Virgin Islands. I opened the receipt. My $500,000 had not purchased a bed in a world-class medical facility. It had purchased a 60-foot luxury yacht registered under an anonymous corporate entity. I felt a surge of physical nausea. Every picture they had posted online, every lavish party they had thrown, was funded by the torture of an innocent boy. The mechanics of their operation were brutally clear, and the horrifying realization of their true motive washed over me like a tidal wave. They were not just neglecting Leo because they were cruel or overwhelmed. They were intentionally keeping him alive. If Leo died, the trust fund would trigger a mandatory federal audit to distribute the remaining assets to secondary charities, as stipulated by Monica's parents. If he passed away, the money train would instantly stop, and the federal government would scrutinize every single penny that had been withdrawn. They needed Leo breathing. They needed his heart beating just enough to maintain their status as active guardians. They chained him in that freezing attic, feeding him the absolute bare minimum to sustain his vital organs, ensuring his survival while minimizing their own inconvenience. They had effectively turned a human being into a captive, suffering revenue stream. I gripped the edge of my desk, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. My own son was orchestrating a modern-day dungeon completely devoid of basic human empathy. I pulled my reading glasses off and rubbed my tired eyes, trying to process the magnitude of their depravity. I had always known Bradley was ambitious, maybe even greedy, but this was a level of darkness I could have never imagined residing within my own family. I looked back at the computer screen. I had finally uncovered the true source of their stolen wealth, the absolute origin of the trust fund, and the horrifying extent of their physical abuse. I possessed more than enough evidence right here to completely ruin their social standing and send them both to federal prison for long-term financial fraud. But there was still exactly one hidden folder left at the very bottom of the directory tree. It was separated from the financial documents, heavily encrypted with a secondary lock, and labeled simply as contingency plan. A deep, unsettling instinct told me that the offshore bank accounts and the stolen yacht that were only the surface layer of this nightmare. I calmly clicked on the folder typed in the same vain password and waited as the hidden files slowly decrypted on my screen. I did not know it yet, but the contents of that final folder were about to reveal a betrayal so profound it would completely erase any lingering trace of paternal love I still held for my son. The decryption process finished with a soft chime signaling the opening of the encrypted files. I leaned forward, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as the contents of the contingency folder finally populated on the screen. There were no financial spreadsheets here, no yacht receipts, no offshore banking logs. Instead, the folder contained hundreds of scanned legal documents, state tax filings, and federal medical guardian registration forms. I double-clicked the first document expecting to see Bradley and Monica listed as the primary custodians. But as the high-resolution scan loaded on my monitor, my eyes fell upon the official letterhead. It was not a generic banking header. It was the bold, familiar logo of Caldwell Structural Engineering, the company I had built from the ground up and retired from 5 years ago. A cold, creeping numbness began to spread from my chest down into my fingertips. I scrolled down the page, my mind struggling to process the information, staring back at me. It was an official state custodial transfer document, seemingly filed nearly 2 years ago. According to the paperwork, Bradley and Monica had legally resigned as Leo's primary guardians due to alleged emotional distress and severe financial hardship. The document officially transferred complete legal and physical custody, along with absolute control of the $3 million trust fund, to a new primary caregiver. I moved my mouse and zoomed in on the signature line at the very bottom of the page. There, executed in perfect, flawless blue ink, was my own signature. Richard Caldwell. I sat completely paralyzed in my desk chair. I pulled off my reading glasses, rubbed my eyes hard, and put them back on, praying that my 70-year-old vision was simply playing tricks on me. But the digital ink remained unchanged. I clicked open the next file in the directory. It was a massive corporate registration packet for a medical holding company called Caldwell Care Logistics. I had never heard of this company in my entire life, but the registration papers listed my home address, my social security number, and my old executive credentials from the engineering firm as the founding director. Bradley had not just set up anonymous shell companies in the Caribbean. He had built a vast, fraudulent corporate medical empire entirely in my name. The sheer, calculated malice of his plan began to assemble itself in my mind like a terrifying jigsaw puzzle. I opened file after file, finding dozens of forged authorization forms, fake psychiatric evaluations, and falsified medical supply orders. Every single one of them bore my forged digital signature. Bradley had utilized his intimate knowledge of my old business routines to hijack my inactive executive credentials. Because I was a retired contractor with a spotless 40-year financial history and an impeccable credit score, the banks and state agencies never flagged the massive transfers. My sterling reputation was the perfect, unquestionable shield for their criminal enterprise. They were laundering millions of dollars through my ghost company, and the government believed I was the one pulling the strings. I leaned back, feeling physically sick as the true depth of the betrayal washed over me. This was not just a case of greedy children stealing money from a disabled relative. This was an incredibly sophisticated, premeditated frame-up. I looked at the folder title again. Contingency Plan. The name suddenly made horrific, perfect sense. Bradley was a master of risk management. He knew that starving an autistic man in a freezing attic was a ticking time bomb. He knew that eventually a neighbor might hear a scream, a delivery driver might notice a smell, or the state might demand an in-person welfare check. He needed a bulletproof exit strategy for the exact moment their house of cards collapsed. If Leo succumbed to the freezing temperatures, the malnutrition, or the brutal infected wounds on his wrists, there would be a massive police investigation. Detectives would swarm the Lincoln Park house. They would find the body. They would follow the money trail. And that trail had been meticulously engineered by my own son to lead the federal authorities straight to my quiet suburban front door. The police would look at the documents. They would see that Richard Caldwell was the sole legal guardian. They would see that Richard Caldwell authorized every fraudulent withdrawal. Bradley and Monica would play the roles of grieving, oblivious family members who had trusted their respected father to care for their vulnerable brother. I could vividly picture the trial. I could see the prosecutors holding up these exact documents, painting me as a greedy, sociopathic old man who locked a disabled boy in an attic to steal his fortune. At 70 years old, facing charges of massive wire fraud, elder exploitation, and negligent homicide, I would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary again. I would die in a concrete cell, stripped of my dignity, my assets, and my name. Meanwhile, Bradley and Monica would legally inherit whatever was left of my estate, consolidating their stolen wealth while playing the victims of a monstrous father. The cruelty was so absolute, so devoid of human empathy, that it took my breath away. I had spent my entire life protecting my son. I had worked double shifts in the blistering heat and the freezing snow to pay for his college tuition. I had quietly handed over $500,000 so he could buy the very house where he was currently staging my destruction. He had smiled in my face, eaten at my dinner table, and called me Dad, all while carefully weaving the noose he intended to slip around my neck. The pain of that realization was sharper than any physical injury I had ever sustained on a construction site. It felt like a massive blade twisting slowly in my gut, severing the last remaining bonds of fatherhood. I stared at the glowing monitor, the forged documents burning into my vision. The initial shock began to fade slowly, replaced by a rising tide of pure, focused rage. Bradley thought he had accounted for every possible variable. He thought his contingency plan was an impenetrable masterpiece of corporate deceit. But he had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the structural integrity of the man he was trying to destroy. He assumed that because I was old, because I loved him, I would be blind to his machinations until the federal agents kicked my door down. He had forgotten that I spent 4 decades catching fraudulent contractors and dismantling bad blueprints. I reached forward and carefully copied the entire directory of forged documents onto a secure external hard drive. I systematically backed up every fake medical invoice, every offshore transfer log, and every piece of the custody transfer paperwork. I was not going to let him control the narrative. If my son wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial chess, I was going to wipe his entire board clean. I safely ejected the hard drive and slipped it into my pocket right next to the original titanium flash drive. The digital evidence was fully secured. Now I needed to act. I glanced down at the glowing green numbers on my desk clock. It was 2:17 in the morning. A normal man would wait until daylight to start a war, but I was no longer operating under the rules of polite society. I picked up my cell phone and scrolled past my personal contacts, stopping at a name I only kept for absolute worst-case scenarios. Harrison Cole was not a family lawyer. He was a ruthless, high-priced corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and burying people in endless litigation. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now, I needed a shark. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring in the dead of night. He picked up on the 5th ring, his voice groggy but instantly alert, demanding to know who was calling at this hour. I told him it was Rick Caldwell and that I needed him at my house immediately. He tried to protest, citing the time and asking if it could wait until morning. I cut him off, telling him that my son had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar federal fraud using my stolen credentials. The line went dead silent. 10 seconds later, Harrison told me to put on a pot of coffee and that he was leaving his downtown apartment right now. Harrison arrived at my front door less than 40 minutes later. He was wearing a dark overcoat over a wrinkled dress shirt, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 corporate battles. I led him straight back to my home office, quietly closing the heavy oak door behind us to ensure we did not disturb Gregory or Leo. I pointed to the glowing monitor of my desktop computer and told him to sit down. Harrison did not ask any pointless questions. He dropped his briefcase onto the floor, took my seat, and began clicking through the files I had copied from Bradley's encrypted flash drive. I stood behind him, watching his eyes dart across the screen as he opened the offshore bank statements, the luxury yacht receipts, and the fake psychiatric evaluations. He remained perfectly silent, his face a mask of professional detachment. But when he finally opened the contingency folder and pulled up the registration papers for Caldwell Care Logistics, I saw something I had never seen before. The color completely drained from Harrison's face. His hands stopped moving over the keyboard. He sat back in the chair, pulling off his expensive wire-rimmed glasses, and rubbed his temples with a trembling hand. "Rick," he whispered, his voice stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. "Tell me you did not sign these documents. Tell me you did not authorize the creation of this medical holding company." I looked down at him, my expression completely flat, and told him that until tonight, I had never even heard of Caldwell Care Logistics. I told him that Bradley had used my old executive login credentials from the engineering firm to bypass the state security protocols and forge my digital signature. Harrison stared at the screen for a long, horrifying moment. He pulled up the state custodial transfer forms, zooming in on the perfect replication of my signature at the bottom of the page. He shook his head slowly, letting out a heavy breath that sounded more like a death rattle. "They did not just forge a few checks, Rick. They built an entire criminal enterprise around your identity. They made you the sole primary legal guardian of this $3 million trust fund and the managing director of the company billing the trust." I leaned against the heavy wooden bookshelf, crossing my arms over my chest. I asked him to explain exactly what that meant in a court of law. Harrison turned his chair to face me, his expression grim and terrifyingly serious. "It means that they are not just stealing money," he said slowly, pronouncing every word with deliberate weight. "They are actively setting you up to die in a federal penitentiary. Look at this digital paper trail. Every dollar drained from that trust fund officially leads right back to your name. Every fake invoice for medical equipment, every phantom nursing consultation, it all carries your digital authorization. If the federal government audits this trust, or worse, if the poor boy tied up in your guest room actually succumbs to his injuries and dies, the police will not arrest Bradley. They will arrest you. You are the legal guardian on paper. You are the one supposedly starving him. You are the one committing wire fraud across international borders. They have perfectly framed a 70-year-old man for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and negligent homicide." Harrison stood up and began pacing the length of my office, running his hands through his thinning hair. "The sheer malice of the plan is staggering," he muttered almost to himself. "If you go to federal prison for the rest of your natural life, everything you own, your retirement accounts, your properties, your entire commercial estate defaults to your next of kin." Bradley would not only walk away clean with the $3 million he stole from the Special Needs Trust, but he would also inherit the entirety of the Caldwell construction fortune. He is using you as a human shield and a golden goose at the exact same time. The air in the office felt incredibly thin, heavy with the suffocating reality of my son's ultimate betrayal. A normal father might have collapsed right there. A normal man might have broken down into hysterical tears, but I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a profound, freezing calm wash over my entire nervous system. I walked over to my desk and looked at Harrison. I told him we could not call the police immediately. Harrison looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Rick," he argued, his voice rising in panic, "you are sitting on a live bomb. We need to get ahead of this. If we hand this drive over to the FBI immediately, we can claim whistleblower status." I shook my head, rejecting his legal panic. You do not understand how my son operates, Harrison. Bradley is a corporate finance executive. He spends his entire life anticipating market fluctuations. The absolute second Bradley smells a badge on his front porch, he will reach into his pocket and click a single button. I pointed to the offshore banking ledgers displayed on the monitor. Look at these wire transfers. He has liquid assets sitting in jurisdictions that do not honor American extradition treaties. If he gets even a slight hint that the authorities are investigating him, he will transfer every single stolen dollar into an untraceable account before the police even finish reading him his rights. He will vanish the money lawyer up and point his finger directly at the forged documents bearing my name. The money meant to care for Leo will be gone forever. We must cut off the snake's head financially first. Before the police arrive, we must ensure he has nowhere left to run. Exactly. I glanced down at the glowing green numbers on my desk clock. It was 2:17 in the morning. A normal man would wait for daylight to start a war, but I was done with polite society. I picked up my phone and called Harrison Cole, a ruthless corporate litigator I kept for absolute worst-case scenarios. I pressed the call button. He answered groggily, but instantly alert, demanding to know who was calling. I told him it was Rick Caldwell, and I needed him immediately. He tried to protest the time. I cut him off, explaining my son had orchestrated a massive federal fraud using my stolen credentials. The line went dead silent. 10 seconds later, Harrison told me to brew coffee and that he was on his way. Harrison arrived at my front door 40 minutes later. He was wearing a dark overcoat over a wrinkled dress shirt, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. I led him straight to my home office, quietly closing the heavy oak door behind us to ensure we did not disturb Gregory or Leo. I pointed to the glowing monitor of my desktop computer and told him to sit down. Harrison did not ask any pointless questions. He dropped his briefcase, took my seat, and began clicking through the files from Bradley's encrypted flash drive. I stood behind him, watching his eyes dart across the screen as he opened the offshore bank statements and the fake psychiatric evaluations. He remained perfectly silent, his face a mask of professional detachment. But when he finally opened the contingency folder and pulled up the registration papers for Caldwell Care Logistics, I saw something I had never seen before. The color completely drained from Harrison's face. His hands stopped moving over the keyboard entirely. He sat back, pulling off his expensive wire-rimmed glasses, and rubbed his temples with a trembling hand. Rick, he whispered, his voice stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. Tell me you did not sign these documents or authorize this medical holding company. I looked down at him, my expression completely flat, and told him that until tonight, I had never even heard of Caldwell Care Logistics. Bradley used my old executive credentials to bypass state security and forge my digital signature. Harrison stared at the screen for a long, horrifying moment. They did not just forge a few checks, Rick, he said slowly. They built an entire criminal enterprise around your identity. They made you the sole legal guardian of this $3 million trust fund and the managing director of the company billing it. If the federal government audits this trust, or if the boy in your guest room dies, the police will not arrest Bradley. They will arrest you. You are the one committing wire fraud across international borders. They have perfectly framed a 70-year-old man for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and negligent homicide. But Harrison Webster said calmly, leaning against the bookshelf, there is one massive flaw in my son's brilliant contingency plan. By forging my signature and making me the supreme director of his shell companies, he legally handed me absolute, unquestionable authority over every single bank account he possesses. He pulled out his own laptop and connected to my network. He explained that we needed to act with absolute surgical precision. If we reported the fraud through standard banking channels, it would trigger a slow, bureaucratic investigation. That delay would give Bradley enough time to electronically scatter the remaining funds across dozens of untraceable global accounts. We needed a catastrophic, instantaneous shutdown. Harrison dialed a secure, unlisted number for a senior crisis manager at the primary international bank handling the trust transfers. When the executive answered, Harrison identified himself as my primary counsel and placed the phone on speaker. I spoke directly into the microphone verbally, confirming my identity, my social security number, and my old executive identification codes. I formally requested an immediate comprehensive hard freeze on every single account ledger and trust associated with my name and the holding company. The banker typed furiously on his end, verifying the biometric security prompts I provided. Within 90 seconds, the confirmation echoed through the speaker. The accounts were completely locked. No money could be transferred out, and no external access would be granted. Bradley was officially cut off from his stolen empire, but shutting off the money was only the first half of the strategy. Bradley was still sitting in a luxury ski lodge in Aspen. If he woke up, checked his banking apps, and saw the frozen accounts, his survival instincts would instantly take over. He would assume the federal authorities were closing in, and instead of flying home, he would charter a private jet to a country without an extradition treaty, leaving me holding the bag for his crimes. We needed to ensure that his greed blinded his logic. We needed him to sprint back to Chicago on the very next flight. I looked at Harrison and told him we needed to set a trap that Bradley could not possibly resist. "We use his own arrogance against him," Harrison said, typing a new command into the secure banking portal. I authorized a personal wire transfer of $200,000 directly from my legitimate, clean retirement savings account into the primary shell account Bradley used to siphon the special needs trust. As soon as the transfer was initiated, Harrison immediately flagged the deposit using a highly specific internal banking code known as a Tier 1 security hold. Harrison explained the mechanics of the trap as he finalized the digital paperwork. By forcing a massive sudden influx of clean cash into a frozen offshore routing account, we triggered a catastrophic automated security protocol. The system would view this as a potential verification test by the account holder. The hold locked the entire balance of the stolen millions in a state of suspended animation. Because the account was legally structured under the guise of a domestic medical logistics company, the Tier 1 flag could not be cleared over the phone or through a digital signature. It required physical in-person verification. The bank would automatically generate an urgent alert and send it to Bradley's phone. The alert would inform him that a security anomaly had frozen his entire portfolio. It would state that the millions along with the fresh deposit were pending permanent federal seizure unless the secondary authorized account holder appeared physically at the main Chicago branch within 48 hours to officially sign the release documents. I leaned back, staring at the green confirmation screen. Bradley would wake up in Aspen and see the alert. Losing his stolen empire would terrify him, but the massive new deposit would confuse him. It would make him believe the freeze was just a simple bureaucratic glitch caused by an influx of cash rather than a targeted strike. His insatiable greed would completely override his caution. He would not run away. He would frantically pack his bags, grab his wife, and sprint to the airport, desperate to return to Chicago and secure his fortune. The trap was set. Complete and utter hell was finally coming home. The digital evidence was fully secured. Now I needed to act. I left Harrison sitting in my home office, poring over the offshore ledgers, and I walked out into the bitter, freezing Chicago night. The cold bit at my exposed skin as I unlocked the steel storage box in the bed of my truck. During my 40 years in the commercial construction business, I had overseen the installation of high-end security systems for massive corporate complexes and secure government facilities. I knew exactly how to wire a room so that the people inside had absolutely no idea they were being watched. I grabbed a reinforced black case containing a series of wireless microcameras and highly sensitive audio transmitters. I threw the heavy case onto the passenger seat and started the engine. Bradley and Monica were roughly 3 hours away from landing at O'Hare International Airport. Their pure panic over the frozen offshore accounts would blind them to any minor details, but I was not going to leave anything to chance. Every single move I made tonight had to be executed with the flawless precision of a master builder. I drove back toward the Lincoln Park neighborhood, navigating the empty, darkened streets. The towering mansions looked like silent monuments to greed in the moonlight. I pulled into the alleyway behind their property parked out of sight and slipped quietly through the back gate. I unlocked the back door and stepped inside the silent kitchen. The house still smelled of expensive candles and polished hardwood. It was a suffocating scent, masking the pure rot that lived in the attic above. I moved quickly and quietly into the main living room, the central hub where I knew the initial confrontation would inevitably take place. I opened the black case and removed the first microcamera. It was no larger than a small button designed to blend seamlessly into modern electronics. I unscrewed the faceplate of the smart thermostat mounted on the wall across from the front door. I wired the tiny lens into the internal power supply, securing it behind the digital display. It provided a perfect, unobstructed wide-angle view of the entire entrance hall and the massive leather sofas. Next, I took two specialized audio transmitters. They were highly sensitive acoustic bugs that could pick up a faint whisper from over 30 feet away. I placed one deep inside the return air vent above the massive stone fireplace, and I hid the other securely behind a row of heavy, unread encyclopedia volumes on Bradley's custom-built bookshelf. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket and synced the devices to my private encrypted server. The high-definition video feed popped onto my screen, crisp and perfectly clear. I could easily hear the faint ambient hum of the central heating unit through the audio feed. The living room was perfectly rigged, capturing every possible angle of entry. Now I had to secure the darkest, most critical location of all. I walked down the hallway, the total silence pressing heavily against my ears. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and stood before the heavy door leading to the attic. I pulled the heavy industrial padlock from my pocket, the exact lock I had cut just a few hours ago. I had brought a replacement steel shackle from my truck to make it look entirely whole and undisturbed. I pushed the door open and climbed the narrow freezing stairs into the desolate space. The temperature had plummeted even further in the dead of night. The foul, sharp smell of the dirt and extreme neglect hit the back of my throat, bringing a fresh, burning wave of fury to my chest. I walked over to the filthy, stained mattress resting alone on the rough floorboards. Leo was safely asleep under Gregory's watchful eye miles away, but Bradley and Monica needed to believe their captive was exactly where they left him. I opened a heavy canvas duffel bag I had carried up from the truck. Inside were 3 massive, thick winter parkas and several dense wool blankets. I arranged the heavy coats on the mattress, carefully bunching the thick sleeves and hoods to mimic the precise shape of a human body curled into a tight, defensive fetal position. I draped Leo's thin, stained flannel shirt over the top of the bulky coats. Finally, I pulled the filthy gray blanket over the entire mound, tucking the frayed edges tightly around the shapes. In the dim light of the attic, the illusion was flawless. It looked exactly like a freezing, terrified boy huddled beneath the covers trying to preserve his failing body heat. I took a step back, studying the decoy from multiple angles to ensure there were no visible flaws. Satisfied, I pulled the final micro camera from my case. I mounted it directly into the wooden rafter right above the mattress, angling the tiny lens downward to capture the heavy metal chain, the decoy on the floor, and the doorway leading up from the stairs. I synced the final camera to my network, verifying the live feed on my screen. I walked back down the stairs, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I hooked the massive industrial padlock through the metal latch and snapped it shut. The heavy metallic click echoed loudly through the empty hallway, sealing the illusion perfectly. I did a final meticulous sweep of the house, erasing any lingering trace of my presence. I smoothed out the fibers of the expensive rugs, wiped the dust from the attic doorknob, and ensured every lock was perfectly secure. I slipped out the back door and melted into the deep shadows of the alleyway. I walked down the street, keeping my head low against the biting winter wind, until I reached my truck, parked discreetly 2 blocks away. I climbed into the cab, shivering slightly, and turned the heater on the lowest possible setting to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. I placed my heavy laptop on the center console and opened the screen. The monitor illuminated the dark cabin with a soft, pale blue glow. I arranged the software to display a split screen of the live surveillance feeds. On the left side of the monitor, I had a perfect high-definition view of the luxurious, pristine living room. On the right side, the feed showed the bleak, freezing attic with the huddled mass of coats perfectly mimicking Leo on the dirty mattress. The audio channels hummed with absolute unbroken silence. I settled back into the driver's seat, pulling my coat tight against my chest. The trap was now meticulously set. The offshore bank accounts were entirely frozen. The digital evidence was fully secure. The surveillance grid was operational. Bradley and Monica were flying back to Chicago right now, entirely consumed by their own insatiable greed, completely unaware that they were sprinting headfirst into a concrete wall. I sat in the freezing darkness of my truck, my eyes fixed intently on the glowing monitor. I did not blink. I did not even sleep. I simply watched the empty, silent rooms on my screen, waiting, with the cold, absolute patience of a man who was about to completely destroy his son's life. The pale gray light of early morning slowly began to bleed through the frost-covered windshield of my truck. I sat motionless in the driver's seat for 5 agonizing hours, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the split-screen monitor. The suburban street slowly woke up around me, but my entire universe was confined to the silent digital feeds inside that sprawling Lincoln Park house. At exactly 6:14 in the morning, the heavy silence on the audio channel was finally broken by the sharp, aggressive crunch of tires violently pulling into the paved driveway. A sleek black airport transport vehicle braked hard near the front portico. The rear passenger doors flew open before the driver had even shifted the car into park. Bradley and Monica practically tumbled out onto the freezing concrete. They were not moving like wealthy vacationers returning from a relaxing, luxury ski trip. They were moving like desperate fugitives fleeing a burning building. Bradley yanked 2 massive designer ski bags from the open trunk, tossing them carelessly onto the manicured front lawn. He did not bother tipping the driver. He did not even close the trunk. He just grabbed Monica by the arm and practically dragged her toward the heavy front door. Through the hidden micro-camera I had wired behind the smart thermostat, I watched the heavy oak door violently swing open. It slammed hard against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through my audio feed. Bradley dropped the heavy canvas bags directly onto the pristine hardwood floor, kicking them aggressively out of his way. Monica stumbled in behind him, her face flushed red, completely abandoning her usual perfectly composed posture. They were breathing heavily, their chests heaving in absolute panic. But what struck me the most, what truly solidified the utter darkness rotting inside their hearts, was their complete and total lack of upward movement. Not once did Bradley look toward the second-floor staircase. Not once did Monica glance upward toward the hidden attic door. They believed her fragile brother was currently chained to a floor beam, in the freezing dark, suffering alone through the winter night. A normal human being would have instantly run upstairs to check on the captive they had abandoned. They did not even pause to listen for a cry. They completely ignored the second floor. They sprinted directly past the grand staircase and bolted straight into the massive open-concept kitchen. The secondary camera captured Bradley as he ripped his heavy winter coat off his shoulders, letting it fall onto the imported rug. He unzipped his leather carry-on bag with violent shaking hands, pulled out his silver laptop, and slammed it down onto the polished granite surface of the kitchen island. The heavy impact made the expensive stone counter vibrate. He flipped the screen open, his fingers hammering the keys with a frantic, desperate rhythm. Monica began pacing the length of the kitchen floor like a caged, terrified animal. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking violently. She raised her fingers to her mouth and began aggressively chewing on her expensive acrylic nails. "Brad," she screamed, her voice echoing sharply through the hidden audio transmitter. "Tell me it is a mistake. Tell me the bank application was just glitching at the airport. You told me the offshore accounts were completely untouchable. You said they were untraceable." Bradley did not answer her. He was staring at the glowing screen of his laptop, his face entirely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution order being finalized. He slammed his fist down onto the granite countertop so hard, the sound spiked the audio levels on my laptop. "No, no, no," Bradley chanted, his voice dropping into a desperate, panicked whisper. "This makes no sense. The main holding account is completely locked. The Cayman disbursements are grayed out. Everything is frozen, Monica. Every single dollar we transferred over the last 2 years is under a hard security freeze." Monica stopped pacing and grabbed the edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles turning white as she leaned over the screen. "What does the notification say?" she demanded, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Read the damn notification, Bradley." "What triggered the lock?" Bradley scrolled down the page, his breathing ragged. He read the text aloud, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "It says there is a Tier 1 security hold on the entire primary portfolio. A sudden, unverified influx of $200,000 triggered an automated federal fraud protocol. The system believes the account is compromised from an external source." Monica let out a high, terrifying shriek. $200,000, she screamed. "Where did $200,000 come from? We did not authorize any new transfers. Who put that money into our account?" Bradley gripped the edges of his laptop, his knuckles white. "I do not know," he yelled back, his arrogant corporate persona completely shattering. "The routing number is masked, but it does not matter where it came from. What matters is the release protocol. The bank will not let me authorize a digital bypass. Because the account is registered as a medical holding firm, they require physical in-person verification to lift a Tier 1 security mandate. I have to physically walk into the main downtown Chicago branch, present my executive identification, and sign the unfreezing documents in front of a senior wealth manager." Monica stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. "If you walk into that bank and sign those papers, you are tying yourself to every fraudulent medical invoice we filed for the last 2 years, she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "If this is a federal trap, they will arrest you the absolute second you sign your name." Bradley shoved the laptop away, running his trembling hands through his hair. "If I do not sign the release papers within 48 hours, the bank legally surrenders the entire frozen portfolio to the federal authorities for a commercial audit." He fired back, his voice thick with panic. "They will freeze the house. They will freeze our domestic checking accounts. They will track the money back to the Special Needs Trust, and they will find Leo upstairs. We will lose the yacht, the property, the cars, everything. We will be completely ruined, Monica." I sat in the freezing cab of my truck, watching the collapse of their miserable empire unfold in high definition. I watched my son, the financial strategist, hyperventilate over a pile of stolen money. I listened to Monica, the polished socialite, weeping over the potential loss of a luxury yacht, while she believed her own flesh and blood was slowly freezing to death above her head. Their greed had eclipsed their humanity. They were not mourning a mistake. They were simply terrified of losing their stolen wealth. They were paralyzed by the trap I had meticulously laid for them. I closed the lid of my laptop, cutting off the frantic, desperate audio feed. The trap had worked with absolute flawless perfection. The monsters were finally locked inside the cage, completely blind to the fact that I held the only key. The high-definition video feed on my laptop screen remained perfectly stable, capturing every frantic movement inside the luxurious kitchen. I sat completely still in the freezing cab of my truck, watching the two people I had once considered family tear each other apart over a frozen bank account. Monica was no longer just pacing. She was practically vibrating with a feral, unhinged energy. The pristine image of the wealthy suburban wife had completely melted away, leaving behind something utterly hollow and vicious. She grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the edge of the kitchen island and hurled it across the room. It shattered violently against the custom brickwork of the fireplace, sending sharp shards of glass scattering across the expensive hardwood floor. The sound exploded through the audio transmitters, making me flinch slightly in the driver's seat. Bradley did not even flinch at the shattering glass. He was entirely consumed by the glowing screen of his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate, futile attempt to bypass the Tier 1 security protocol. His face was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot from the overnight flight and the sheer adrenaline of his collapsing empire. He kept muttering under his breath, cursing the bank, cursing the automated security flags, and desperately trying to formulate a new strategy. But there was no strategy left. He was trapped in a digital corner, and Monica knew it. She stormed over to the kitchen island, slamming her hands down onto the granite surface right next to his laptop. The sharp acoustic crack of her palms hitting the stone echoed perfectly through my hidden microphones. She leaned in close to his face, her voice dripping with a venomous, absolute hatred. "I told you this was a mistake, Brad," she screamed, her voice completely stripped of its usual melodic tone. "I told you we should have handled this before we got on that plane. I told you to up his sedative dosage before we left. If your stupid father had not called about the cleaner, the pig would have frozen to death by now, and we would have the perfect alibi in Aspen." I stopped breathing. The air in my truck felt like it had been instantly vacuumed out. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my joints ached with the pressure. I had already known they were abusing Leo for the trust fund. I had already known they had forged my signature to create the medical holding company. But hearing Monica explicitly confirm that they had actively planned to murder a disabled, defenseless boy by intentional hypothermia while they sipped champagne at a ski resort pushed me into a realm of anger I had never experienced. They had not just abandoned him. They had carefully calculated his death sentence. Bradley finally looked up from the laptop. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, arrogant fury. He slammed the computer shut and stood up, towering over his wife. He pointed a trembling finger directly at her chest. "That was the plan, Monica." He fired back, his voice echoing loudly through the massive living room. "That was the entire point of the timeline. We let him freeze in the attic while we are halfway across the country. We come home, we discover the tragedy, and we call the cops in hysterics. When the federal investigators show up, they follow the money. And what do they find? The digital trail points directly to my dad's company holding the trust. We play the devastated family members who trusted my respected father to care for his vulnerable patient. Dad goes to federal prison for medical neglect and massive corporate fraud, and we inherit everything clean. The construction business, the real estate, the retirement accounts. We walk away with a combined fortune, and the state locks him away forever." The sheer magnitude of his spoken confession rang through the speakers of my laptop with crystal clarity. He had just laid out his entire murderous conspiracy, detailing his exact intent to frame his own father and kill his brother-in-law for financial gain. Every single word was currently being recorded, encrypted, and saved on my secure server. He had handed me the absolute weapon of his own destruction on a silver platter. I stared at his face on the monitor. I searched his features for any trace of the little boy I had raised, any hint of the son I had taken to baseball games and taught how to ride a bicycle. There was nothing left. The man on the screen was a complete stranger, a sociopathic parasite who viewed human lives as disposable assets on a corporate balance sheet. The final lingering thread of my paternal affection snapped, instantly replaced by the cold, unyielding resolve of a judge ready to deliver a final sentence. Monica backed away from him, running her hands through her tangled hair. "But the money is frozen, Brad!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "If we do not walk into that bank and sign those release papers by tomorrow, they trigger an audit. The police will come here. They will search the house. They will go upstairs and find Leo. We have to go to the bank right now. We have to unfreeze the accounts and transfer the funds to the Cayman Holdings before anyone looks at the trust documents. We have to get out of this country today." Bradley shook his head, his face slick with cold sweat. "I cannot walk into that bank yet, Monica. If I sign those papers right now, I legally verify the recent fraudulent invoices. I need to get onto my father's secure server first. I need to alter the digital log files to make sure the $200,000 deposit reflects as an authorized transfer from his personal terminal. I have to lock the frame up in place before I show my face at the branch. I just need a few more hours to hack his credentials. I had heard absolutely enough. The trial was over. The verdict was guilty. I reached out and tapped a specific command key on my laptop keyboard. The encrypted software instantly opened a secure communication channel. I routed the live video and audio feed directly to Harrison Cole. Harrison was currently sitting in a black suburban utility vehicle parked discreetly 3 blocks away, completely surrounded by a specialized team of federal financial investigators and local law enforcement officers. We had coordinated the entire strike team, while Bradley was 30,000 feet in the air. I sent a single text message to Harrison's private number. The message simply read, "The wolves are talking. Move in now." I closed the laptop and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I reached for the door handle, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing morning. I buttoned my heavy coat, walking slowly down the manicured sidewalk toward the massive house. Every step I took felt heavy with absolute purpose. I was not walking toward a tearful family reconciliation. I was marching toward an execution of justice. I reached the driveway and smiled. Hell was finally here. I walked up the concrete steps leading to the grand front entrance of the massive Lincoln Park house. My heavy winter boots made a steady sound against the frozen stone. I raised my right foot and kicked the heavy oak door squarely in the center. The heavy lock shattered instantly. The wood splintered with a violent crack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The heavy door flew inward, crashing against the plaster wall of the foyer. I stepped over the threshold into the sudden warmth of the house, letting the cold, bitter winter wind blow in right behind me. Bradley and Monica jumped back from the kitchen island, their eyes wide with shock. But the absolute second his eyes focused on my face, I watched his entire demeanor shift. The panic vanished instantly, replaced by the polished mask of a desperate, concerned son. Dad Bradley gasped, rushing forward into the foyer with his hands raised in a gesture of overwhelming relief. "Thank God you are here." Monica called the house phone earlier, and Gregory did not answer. We were so worried about Leo. We dropped our bags and we were just about to run upstairs to check on him. Monica nodded frantically behind him, her hands trembling as she pulled her cardigan tight across her chest. "We were terrified, Richard," she chimed in, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. "We had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. We did not wait to check out of the hotel. We just had to get back to him. Less than 10 minutes ago, I had listened to this exact same woman scream about losing her luxury yacht while wishing her brother had frozen to death. Now she was playing the role of a desperate, grieving sister." I looked at Bradley, taking in his wrinkled shirt, his bloodshot eyes, and the desperate, pleading posture he had assumed. I did not say a single word. I simply unbuttoned my winter coat, reached inside my breast pocket, and pulled out a stack of printed documents. I stepped into the massive kitchen, my boots crunching over the shards of the crystal vase Monica had shattered moments before. I stopped directly in front of the polished granite island right next to Bradley's open laptop. I raised the stack of papers and slammed them down onto the hard stone surface. The heavy slap of the paper hitting the granite echoed sharply through the silent house. "Are you relieved I am here, Brad?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low, completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "Or are you just panicking because you need my physical signature to unfreeze your offshore blood money?" The silence that instantly swallowed the room was absolute. Bradley froze completely mid-step. His mouth hung slightly open, the concerned son routine dying instantly on his face. Monica stopped breathing entirely, her eyes dropping down to the stack of papers resting on the island. The top page was a highly classified bank printout, detailing the exact routing numbers of their Cayman Islands holding accounts, prominently displaying the glaring red letters of a Tier 1 security hold. The color completely drained from Bradley's face. The arrogant swagger that had defined his entire adult life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He stared at the documents, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, the dawning horror finally taking root in his mind. "You did all of this," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling so violently He could barely form the simple words. "You locked the accounts tonight." "I—" "Counts, Bradley," I stated, stepping closer to the island, locking my gaze onto his terrified eyes. "I initiated a comprehensive permanent federal freeze on every single fraudulent shell company you created under my name. I flagged your primary routing number with a massive cash deposit that triggered an automated verification protocol. I built a financial cage around your entire stolen empire, and you sprinted thousands of miles straight into the trap just to save your yacht." Monica let out a pathetic, choked gasp, backing away until her spine hit the stainless steel refrigerator. "You knew," she whimpered, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "You knew about the medical company." "I know everything, Monica," I replied. "I know you forged my digital signature to create Caldwell Care Logistics. I know you manipulated the courts to transfer Leo's primary legal custody entirely into my name. I know you billed the Special Needs Trust for millions of dollars in phantom medical supplies, routing the stolen money through offshore banks to purchase real estate. And I know your brilliant contingency plan was to leave a disabled boy to freeze to death in an unheated attic. Call the police and let the authorities trace the entire criminal enterprise directly back to my front door." Bradley swallowed hard, taking a slow, shaky step backward. "Dad," he started, raising his hands in a defensive posture. "Listen to me. You are confused. You are making a mistake. I can explain the corporate structure. It is totally legal. We were trying to protect the assets for the family. We were trying to protect you. Do not insult my intelligence." I snapped, my voice finally rising with a cold, terrifying authority. "Do not stand in my house and play the corporate victim. I did not just find your encrypted flash drive, Brad. I copied it. I secured every bank ledger, every fraudulent tax return, and every fake medical evaluation. I gave everything to Harrison Cole 3 hours ago." Harrison Cole, Bradley choked out, recognizing the name of the most ruthless corporate litigator in Chicago. "Dad, you gave him the files. You have no idea what you just did." "I know exactly what I did," I countered, leaning forward over the granite island. "I stopped being a clueless 70-year-old man the absolute second I walked upstairs and found a starving boy chained to a floor beam. I unfastened the top button of my shirt, reaching in to pull out my mobile phone. I tapped the screen, bringing up the live surveillance feed from the hidden microcameras. I turned the phone around, shoving the glowing screen directly into Bradley's face. "You see this?" I demanded, my voice dropping back to a dangerous whisper. "I wired this entire house before you landed. I placed audio transmitters in the vents and cameras in the walls. I sat in my truck down the street and listened to every word you said. I heard you complain about the frozen money. I heard Monica wish that Leo had died before you left for Aspen. And I heard you confess your exact plan to send me to a federal penitentiary for negligent homicide so you could inherit my commercial estate." Bradley stared at the live video feed of himself standing in his own expensive kitchen. The absolute reality of his ultimate destruction finally broke through his arrogant denial. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to desperately grip the edge of the heavy counter to keep from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to desperately grip the edge of the heavy counter to keep from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. The heavy silence hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Monica's survival instincts violently kicked in. She did not break down. She did not apologize. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She lunged across the kitchen, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, and snatched her mobile phone from the counter. Her thumbs hammered fiercely against the screen. She raised her head, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, cornered desperation, and aimed the phone directly at my chest like a loaded weapon. "You think you have won, Richard?" Monica hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill, piercing intensity. "You think you can just break into our home and dictate terms to us? You are nothing but an obsolete, retired old man. I am calling 911 right this absolute second." She took another step forward, her breathing ragged, her chest heaving, as she began to weave her improvised narrative. "When the police get here, I am going to tell them exactly what happened. I am going to tell them that my deranged, violent father-in-law kicked my front door off its hinges while we were away. I am going to tell them that you broke into our private residence and kidnapped my severely disabled brother. You stole him, Richard? She continued, her voice rising to a frantic scream, fully immersing herself in the lie. We came home early from our vacation because we were so terrified that something was wrong, and we found our house vandalized and Leo missing. The authorities will not care about your insane conspiracy theories. They will see a broken door, a missing vulnerable adult, and a raving old man standing in my kitchen making wild accusations. Her delusion was staggering. She truly believed that her social status and her pristine suburban facade could shield her from the concrete reality of her actions. She hovered her thumb over the call button, her eyes locked onto mine, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to beg her to put the phone down. But I did not move a single inch. I simply stared at her, my expression completely hollow, watching a sociopath desperately try to rewrite history. The sound of her screaming seemed to jolt Bradley out of his paralyzed state. He pushed himself off the granite island, his knuckles popping as he straightened his posture. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the color back into his pale cheeks. He realized that Monica's frantic threat was their absolute last remaining tactical advantage. If they could maintain the illusion of being the victims of a violent home invasion, they might still salvage their fraudulent empire. Bradley stepped away from the kitchen island and walked slowly toward me. He was taller than I was, broader in the shoulders, fueled by the aggressive arrogance of a man who had never faced a real physical consequence in his entire life. He closed the distance between us, completely violating my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate a 70-year-old man. He loomed over me, the scent of stale airplane coffee and nervous sweat radiating off his expensive clothes. "Put the phone down for a second, Monica," Bradley commanded, never breaking eye contact with me. He lowered his voice into a dark, guttural growl, trying to project a lethal authority. "My dad is a smart man. He knows how the justice system works. He knows that digital evidence trumps the rambling accusations of an angry old contractor. He knows that every single state and federal agency has his name registered as the primary custodian of that trust." Bradley leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes burning with a cornered feral rage. "Here is what is going to happen, Dad. You are going to turn around, walk over to my laptop, and sign your digital authorization to release the Tier 1 security hold. You are going to unfreeze my accounts right now. If you refuse, Monica presses send. The police arrive. I hand them the printed ledgers showing that you personally authorized the transfer of millions of dollars into offshore holding companies. I show them the legal documents proving you resigned Leo's custody to a ghost corporation. We will tell them you locked him in that attic to hide your tracks, and when your guilt became too much, you broke in to stage a kidnapping. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a concrete cell, Dad," Bradley threatened, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "You will lose the business you built. You will lose your reputation. You will lose your freedom. And I will still end up controlling every single asset you own. Do not test me. I have spent 2 years perfectly engineering this paper trail. It is absolutely bulletproof. Sign the release forms, walk out that shattered front door, and we will forget this ever happened. Refuse me and I will personally guarantee that you die in federal prison." He stood there, his broad chest puffed out, breathing heavily through his nose like a cornered bull. He genuinely believed that he had successfully reclaimed the high ground in this war. He thought his imposing physical presence combined with his terrifying legal threats would completely break my psychological resolve. He expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of his perfectly constructed multi-million-dollar frame-up. He expected the exhausted, obsolete old man to instantly surrender to the young, ruthless corporate shark. He wanted me to fall to my knees, beg for his manufactured mercy, and blindly sign away the only leverage I possessed. He truly believed he had accounted for every single moving piece on the board. I looked at my son, staring deeply into the broken, bloodshot vessels of his eyes. I did not step back a single inch. I did not flinch at his towering shadow. I let a long, suffocating silence stretch endlessly between us, allowing his hollow threats to completely evaporate into the freezing winter air that was steadily blowing in from the shattered front door. I maintained a posture of absolute unyielding stillness. I slowly raised my right hand and pointed a single, steady finger straight up toward the ceiling. Bradley frowned, his aggressive posture faltering slightly as his eyes followed my pointing finger. Monica lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Directly above the kitchen island, mounted flush against the pristine white drywall, was a circular plastic smoke detector. Nestled perfectly inside the small ventilation grill of the plastic casing, a tiny pinpoint red light was blinking with a steady rhythmic pulse. I lowered my hand and looked at Monica. "Go ahead and call 911, Monica," I said, my voice resonating with a calm, terrifying finality. "Though I think they are already on their way. They really enjoyed your monologue about freezing your brother to death. Your flawless digital paper trail cannot outrun a live, high-definition federal video broadcast. It is over." The tiny red light nestled inside the plastic ventilation grill of the smoke detector blinked with a steady, rhythmic pulse, acting as the absolute final countdown to their complete destruction. I watched the blood completely drain from Monica's face. Her expensive mobile phone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered heavily onto the polished granite countertop. She stumbled backward, with her breath hitching in her throat as her eyes darted frantically around the pristine kitchen. She was suddenly hyper-aware that the walls themselves were watching her every move. Bradley stood completely paralyzed. His imposing physical posture instantly dissolved into the frail, terrified stance of a cornered animal. He looked from the blinking red light down to the abandoned phone and finally back to my face. He opened his mouth to speak and to offer some pathetic negotiation or another hollow threat, but the words died completely in his throat. He realized the absolute gravity of the trap. I stood perfectly still and watched them process the undeniable reality. Before Bradley could even attempt to formulate a coherent sentence, the heavy, suffocating silence of the suburban neighborhood was violently shattered. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing down the affluent street. The sound rapidly multiplied and amplified into a deafening roar. Within seconds, the shrieking sirens surrounded the property entirely. Harsh, brilliant flashes of red and blue light exploded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room. The strobing lights painted the expensive artwork and the polished hardwood floors in chaotic, violent colors. The heavy tires of multiple armored utility vehicles screeched against the pavement of the long driveway. This was followed immediately by the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut in rapid succession. Monica let out a visceral, high-pitched scream and buried her face in her hands as the reality of her shattered life finally crashed down upon her. The flashing lights illuminated the sheer terror in her wide, unblinking eyes. Heavy, authoritative footsteps thundered across the front porch. The shattered remnants of the front door, which I had kicked off its hinges mere minutes ago, were shoved completely aside with a violent crash. Harrison Cole strode into the foyer like an absolute conqueror. He was no longer the groggy, rumpled attorney from my home office. He was a master litigator, completely in his element and radiating a lethal corporate authority. Flanking him on all sides was a tactical squad of federal white-collar crime agents and local plainclothes detectives. Their presence instantly consumed the massive house. Two agents immediately bypassed the kitchen and sprinted directly up the grand staircase. They swept the second floor to secure the attic and confirm the location of the decoy. Another federal agent moved swiftly toward the granite island. He firmly pushed a weeping Monica aside to physically secure Bradley's open laptop. He quickly sealed the digital evidence of the failed hacking attempt into a sterile evidence bag. The trap was springing shut with absolute military precision. Bradley watched the federal agent bag his laptop and take away his final desperate lifeline. The absolute certainty of his situation finally broke him completely. The arrogant, untouchable corporate shark vanished forever and was replaced by a pathetic, terrified coward. His legs gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hardwood floor. The sharp shards of Monica's broken crystal vase crunched loudly beneath his weight. He crawled forward and closed the short distance between us. He reached out with shaking, desperate hands and grabbed the heavy wool fabric of my winter coat. He clutched it like a drowning man grabbing a frayed lifeline. Tears streamed down his face and completely ruined his polished facade. "Dad," he sobbed, while his voice broke into a high, pathetic whine. "Dad, you have to stop them right now. You have to tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Please, I am your son. I am your flesh and blood. I did not want to do any of this. It was all Monica's idea from the very beginning. She is the one who wanted the offshore accounts. She is the one who set up the medical company. She is the one who demanded we leave Leo in the attic. I was just trying to protect our marriage. You have to protect me, Dad. Please, I will do anything you want. I will give you everything back. Just tell them to let me go." Monica ripped her hands away from her face and stared at her husband in absolute horrified disbelief. He had completely sold her out to save his own skin without a second thought. "You spineless coward!" she shrieked and lunged forward. A federal agent instantly stepped between them and held her back with a firm, unyielding grip. I looked down at Bradley. He was weeping openly and clutching my coat and begging for a paternal salvation that he had spent the last 2 years actively trying to destroy. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. The man kneeling before me had methodically planned my demise and celebrated the torture of an innocent boy. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my coat. I pulled the heavy fabric out of his desperate grasp. I took a deliberate step back and physically and emotionally separated myself from him forever. I looked him dead in his tear-filled eyes and kept my expression as a mask of pure, freezing granite. "I am just a clueless old man, Brad," I said, and my voice resonated with a cold, terrifying emptiness. "I do not know how to fix this. I cannot help you." Bradley let out a hollow, devastated gasp and slumped forward onto the floor, as the absolute finality of my words crushed whatever remaining hope he harbored inside his dark soul. Harrison Cole stepped forward and adjusted his suit jacket with a satisfied, almost predatory smirk on his face. He looked down at the ruined couple and simply nodded his head to the lead federal agent standing nearby. The agent stepped around the granite island and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He grabbed Bradley firmly by the shoulder and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Bradley Caldwell," the agent announced, and his voice boomed with absolute uncompromising authority throughout the massive luxury kitchen. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the lead agent loudly read him his constitutional rights, 2 more local detectives moved in quickly on Monica and securely fastened her wrists behind her back. She thrashed and wailed loudly, while her expensive designer clothing twisted tightly in the violent, desperate physical struggle. "You are both being formally charged with multiple severe federal offenses," the lead agent continued, and intentionally raised his voice over Monica's continuous, hysterical screaming. "The specific charges include massive organized wire fraud and aggravated elder financial exploitation and grand larceny and conspiracy to commit attempted manslaughter. You are going away for a very long time. I have finally won the absolute final battle today." The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her extremely delicate wrists echoed like a gunshot through the pristine kitchen. That single defining sound finally shattered the last remaining fragment of her carefully constructed suburban illusion. The polished, arrogant socialite completely evaporated and was replaced instantly by a feral, unhinged entity. She did not just cry. She erupted into a violent physical meltdown. She threw her entire body weight backward and thrashed wildly against the 2 local detectives who were attempting to secure her arms. Her expensive tailored ski jacket caught on the edge of the granite island and tore a long, jagged seam down the side as she violently kicked and screamed completely, losing her mind in front of everyone. She unleashed a torrent of vile, unfiltered obscenities, screaming at the federal agents and screaming at the local police and ultimately screaming at her own husband. She cursed Bradley for his arrogant stupidity, completely ignoring her own pivotal role in the grotesque conspiracy they had built together. The detectives did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. They simply tightened their professional grips and hoisted her off the polished hardwood floor and began marching her forcefully toward the shattered front entrance. Bradley offered no resistance whatsoever. The federal agents hauled him forward while his head hung low and his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He dragged his feet across the floorboards, completely looking like a hollow, empty shell of the mastermind he had pretended to be. I followed the grim procession out into the freezing Chicago morning. The violent commotion and the shrieking sirens and the flashing red and blue lights had thoroughly shattered the quiet exclusivity of the wealthy Lincoln Park neighborhood. Dozens of affluent residents had stepped out onto their manicured front lawns while wrapping thick bathrobes around their shoulders to ward off the biting cold. They stood in stunned, absolute silence and watched the horrific spectacle unfold in real time. Monica was forcefully dragged down her own front steps, while her face twisted in pure rage and her expensive ski boots scraped awkwardly against the frozen concrete driveway. She screamed loudly at the staring neighbors and demanded they look away, completely humiliated by the public destruction of her pristine standing. The federal agents shoved Bradley into the back of a waiting armored utility vehicle and pushed his head down to clear the doorframe. Monica was placed into a separate local police cruiser, and her hysterical wails were muffled the absolute second the heavy door slammed shut. I stood on the top step of the portico and watched the vehicles idle in the driveway, while feeling a profound, heavy emptiness settling deep into my bones. There was no joy in this victory. There was only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a necessary demolition. Harrison Cole stepped up beside me and adjusted his heavy overcoat against the bitter wind. He did not say a word and allowed the weight of the moment to settle before gesturing inside. The physical arrests were complete, but the grim cleanup operation was just beginning. I turned away from the idling police cruisers and walked back inside the massive house. 2 senior local detectives were waiting for me in the foyer, and their expressions were hard and incredibly professional. I did not need to speak. I simply gestured for them to follow me, and I led them toward the grand staircase. We climbed to the 2nd floor in complete silence. The house felt entirely different now, and stripped of its luxurious facade, it was exposed as nothing more than a hollow, beautifully decorated crime scene. I led the detectives down the long hallway and stopped directly in front of the heavy wooden door that sealed the dark attic. I pulled the key from my pocket and inserted it into the heavy industrial padlock I had placed there hours earlier and twisted it hard. The lock popped open with a heavy click. I pulled the heavy shackle free and pushed the door wide open. The freezing, stagnant air of the desolate space immediately spilled out into the warm hallway and carried the sharp, undeniable stench of severe neglect and human suffering. The detectives switched on their heavy tactical flashlights and cut through the dense, freezing darkness of the unheated space. I led them up the narrow wooden steps, while my heavy boots made a dull thud against the rough boards. As we crested the top of the stairs, the flashlight beams swept across the room. The beams illuminated the bleak, horrifying reality of his absolute, supreme greed. They highlighted the heavy, rusted metal chain securely bolted directly into the load-bearing floor beam. They lingered on the filthy, stained mattress resting directly on the hard floor, and the meager pile of thin blankets, and the plastic bucket sitting in the far corner. The decoy I had built earlier had been removed completely and left only the raw, undeniable evidence of absolute torture. The older detective let out a low, sickened breath and lowered his flashlight slightly as he took in the full extent of the cruelty. He turned to me, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of professional shock and deep, profound human disgust at the undeniable scene. I looked back at him, and my expression remained completely flat as I explained the horrific mechanics of their contingency plan. I detailed how they had deliberately intended to let a disabled boy succumb to the freezing winter temperatures while utilizing the sheer brutality of the elements to mask their massive financial fraud. We walked back downstairs to the main living room and left the crime scene investigators to meticulously document the attic. Harrison Cole was waiting near the shattered fireplace while his leather briefcase rested on the granite island. He had already begun coordinating the massive legal fallout with the lead federal agents. I approached him and pulled the 2 external hard drives from my heavy coat pocket to hand over the final digital evidence now. I placed them on the counter and made sure to explicitly identify the digital evidence packages. I told the federal agent that the primary fraud logs were saved under the specific file names QuangMao 1_15.docx and QuangMao 2_15.docx, which detailed every single fraudulent offshore transfer and fake medical invoice perfectly. Harrison placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, and his voice dropped into a low, reassuring tone. "You did exactly what you had to do, Rick," he said quietly, while surveying the wreckage. I nodded slowly and absorbed his professional guarantee. I looked around the pristine kitchen and took in the expensive custom cabinets. I had provided the money for every single inch of this house. I had built the very foundation they had used to stage my destruction. It was a monument to my own misplaced paternal blind spot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the master keys. I dropped the keys directly into his firm, wide-open palm. "The house is entirely yours now," I told him with absolute finality. I turned around and walked out through the shattered front entrance, forever starting today cleanly. The cold Chicago air bit at my face as I walked down the driveway and away from the flashing red and blue lights. I did not look back at the massive house or the idling police cruisers. My boots hit the pavement with a steady and rhythmic certainty. The explosive violence of the morning was already fading into the quiet mechanics of federal justice. I had initiated the demolition, and now the heavy machinery of the legal system would grind their fractured empire into absolute dust. The following months were a grueling marathon of depositions and federal hearings and relentless courtroom battles. The swift and brutal reality of the federal indictment completely shattered any remaining illusion of loyalty between my son and his wife. The moment the prosecutors laid out the overwhelming mountain of digital and physical evidence on the heavy mahogany tables of the federal courthouse, Bradley and Monica violently turned on each other. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the courtroom and watched the pathetic spectacle unfold. The aggressive corporate swagger Bradley had always projected vanished entirely. He desperately tried to throw Monica under the bus and claimed she was the evil mastermind who manipulated his accounts and isolated her disabled brother. He wept on the stand and begged the judge for a lenient plea deal while claiming he was a victim of marital coercion. Monica was equally vicious. She screamed over her defense attorney and accused Bradley of systemic financial abuse and claimed she was terrified of his violent temper. She swore she only went along with the offshore transfers and the medical holding company because he threatened to leave her destitute. They fought like starving animals fighting over scraps of meat. But the federal prosecutors did not offer a single ounce of mercy or a single plea deal to either of them. The evidence was far too absolute to ignore. My hidden audio recordings echoed through the silent courtroom and broadcasted their cold, calculated intent to freeze a disabled boy to death. The meticulously documented offshore routing numbers completely destroyed their desperate claims of ignorance. The judge stared down from the high bench with an expression of profound, visceral disgust. He did not mince his words when he delivered the final verdict. He called their actions a grotesque monument to human greed and a sickening betrayal of the most vulnerable among us. The final sentence fell like a heavy iron anvil dropping from the sky. Both Bradley and Monica were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no early release for good behavior. They were going to spend the next decade and a half locked inside concrete cells, stripped of their expensive clothes and their precious social status. The federal government moved swiftly to to dismantle the physical remnants of their stolen wealth. The Grand Lincoln Park house, which I had originally financed, was immediately seized by federal agents under strict asset forfeiture laws. The government placed a massive padlock on the front door and officially auctioned off the property. The $1.2 million estate was completely liquidated, and the funds were seized to pay federal fines and victim restitution. Their luxury vehicles were towed away on flatbed trucks by state officials. The yacht they had desperately tried to protect was impounded at the marina and sold. Every single dollar they had, illegally routed through the Cayman Islands, was traced frozen and systematically repatriated by forensic accountants. Their entire fraudulent empire evaporated into thin air, leaving absolutely zero trace that they had ever been wealthy or successful. While the criminal courts handled their physical punishment, I spent my days fighting an entirely different war inside the family court system. Harrison Cole was absolutely relentless. He moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency to completely obliterate Monica's legal standing as a guardian. He presented the terrifying photographs of the freezing attic and the heavy metal chain and the filthy mattress directly to the presiding family court judge. He played the audio files of Monica wishing her own brother had died before they left for their ski vacation. The judge was visibly sickened by the overwhelming cruelty displayed in the courtroom. In a single sweeping ruling, the court permanently stripped Monica of all her guardianship rights and severed her legal ties to Leo completely. She was legally barred from ever contacting him or making a single medical decision on his behalf for the rest of her natural life. The very next morning, I filed the formal legal paperwork to officially adopt Leo. I had spent the last several months sitting by his hospital bed and watching him slowly recover from the severe malnutrition and the profound psychological trauma they had inflicted upon him. He was no longer just a piece of collateral damage in my son's vicious financial war. He was a brave, innocent survivor who desperately needed a real, loving family. The adoption process moved with unprecedented speed due to the extreme circumstances of the federal case. When the judge finally signed the adoption decree and handed me the official stamped document, I felt a profound, immense weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer just the angry man who tore down a massive criminal enterprise. I was a proud father again, and this time I was going to do it exactly right. With the adoption finalized, Harrison and I moved to secure the ultimate prize. We filed a massive civil suit against the frozen ghost corporations and successfully reclaimed the stolen $3 million Special Needs Trust Fund. We ripped every single penny out of Bradley's fabricated corporate structure and placed it directly into a highly secure, heavily monitored, irrevocable trust. I appointed an independent fiduciary board to oversee the disbursements and ensured that the money could only ever be used for Leo's lifelong medical care and personal comfort. The immense fortune was finally permanently safe and completely untethered from Bradley's incredibly toxic legacy. Months later, I stood on the back porch of my newly purchased single-story home in a quiet, peaceful suburb. The warm afternoon sun washed over the green lawn. I held a hot cup of coffee and watched Leo sitting in a comfortable, padded rocking chair under the shade of a large oak tree. He had gained a significant amount of healthy weight, and the dark, hollow circles under his eyes had completely vanished. He was holding a brightly colored picture book, and a soft, genuine smile stretched across his face as he turned the thick pages. He was perfectly safe, and he was warm, and he was finally free from the nightmare. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp, cold, clean air. The agonizing journey through violent betrayal and cruel deception had finally reached its absolute end. I had lost the son I raised, but I had exposed a monster and successfully saved an innocent life. The painful memories of that freezing mansion and the violent arrests were fading into the distant past. I turned away from the setting sun and walked down the wooden steps to sit beside my son, knowing that our future was completely secure. That profound sense of security only deepened as the months rolled forward and blossomed into a gentle and forgiving summer. The harsh and bitter memories of the freezing Chicago winter felt like they belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I had relocated us far away from the toxic suburban mansions and the relentless noise of the city. We were now living quietly at my rustic lakeside cabin nestled deep within the tranquil pine forests of northern Wisconsin. The air out here was incredibly clean and carried the rich scent of sun-baked earth and fresh pine needles. The gentle lapping of the clear blue water against the wooden pylons of the dock provided a constant and soothing rhythm to our new daily routine. I sat peacefully in a deeply weathered wooden rocking chair on the expansive back porch. I held a warm mug of black coffee in my hands and let the soothing morning sun wash over my face. The absolute silence of the wilderness was a welcome blessing. I looked down the long, sloping green lawn toward the edge of the sparkling water and smiled warmly at the beautiful scene unfolding directly in front of me. Leo was standing safely at the very end of the sturdy wooden dock. He looked absolutely transformed. The frail and terrified boy I had discovered shivering and starving in that dark, frozen attic was completely gone. He had gained a significant amount of healthy weight over the past several months. His cheeks were full and naturally flushed with genuine warmth and radiant health. He was wearing a thick and comfortable flannel shirt over a clean white cotton undershirt and sturdy denim jeans. His dark hair was neatly trimmed and brushed back away from his bright and incredibly observant eyes. He held a lightweight fiberglass fishing rod tightly in his hands, and his entire body vibrated with a pure and unfiltered excitement. I watched closely as the small red and white plastic bobber suddenly dipped violently beneath the surface of the rippling water. Leo gasped loudly and expertly yanked the tip of the rod backward, just as I had patiently taught him over the past 3 weeks. The thin, transparent fishing line pulled taut and sliced sharply through the clear water. A brilliant silver sunfish breached the surface and thrashed wildly in the bright, warm morning sunlight. Leo let out a loud and joyful shout of pure triumph that echoed beautifully across the quiet expanse of the peaceful lake. He expertly reeled the small, shimmering fish up onto the wooden planks of the dock and turned around to look back at the cabin. He raised his free hand high into the air and waved frantically toward the porch to ensure I had witnessed his monumental achievement. I raised my coffee mug high in the air to silently salute his victory, and a deep, profound warmth bloomed inside my chest. He was finally living a true childhood. I settled back into the comfortable cushions of the rocking chair and allowed my mind to slowly process the sheer magnitude of our long and agonizing journey. I had spent my entire adult life working relentlessly to build a massive and highly profitable construction empire. I had poured every single ounce of my physical energy and my intellectual focus into generating vast amounts of wealth. I had done it all with the singular fundamental belief that I was creating a permanent and secure legacy for my family. I had genuinely believed that my financial success equaled absolute paternal devotion. But sitting here in the profound stillness of the dense forest, I finally understood the terrifying reality of my monumental miscalculation. I had built a towering financial fortress, but I had completely failed to notice that the foundation was rotting from the inside out. My biological son had inherited my relentless ambition and my sharp mind, but he possessed absolutely zero empathy or human decency. Bradley had looked at the massive wealth I had accumulated and saw only a glorious prize to be brutally conquered. He had viewed his own family members as disposable assets on a corporate balance sheet. I had lost my biological son forever. Bradley was currently sitting in a highly secure federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his arrogant pride and his designer suits and his stolen millions. He would spend the next 15 years staring at concrete walls and regretting the moment he decided to cross me. Monica was locked away in a similar facility and permanently severed from the immense privilege she had ruthlessly guarded. My bloodline had ultimately produced a toxic and merciless predator. I had completely erased him from my life without shedding a single tear or feeling a moment of regret. Yet as I watched Leo carefully unhook the small sunfish and gently release it back into the clear water, I realized something incredibly beautiful. I had lost a biological son, but I had miraculously gained a true and deeply loving family member. The universe had taken away a monster and replaced him with a gentle and innocent soul who desperately needed a father. Leo did not care about the balance of my commercial real estate portfolio or the massive size of my corporate retirement accounts. He simply cared that I was there to watch him catch a fish. He simply cared that I made sure he was warm and safe and completely protected from the dark cruelty of the world. Family is so often viewed as an unbreakable and sacred bond of blood. We are conditioned to believe that our genetic ties are the absolute and final measure of our personal loyalty. But true family is not simply inherited. It is actively forged through unwavering protection and mutual respect and profound fundamental humanity. You can spend an entire lifetime building insurmountable wealth to endlessly provide for your children, only to tragically discover that pure, unfiltered greed can completely destroy them. Greed can easily rot the very foundation you sacrificed everything to build. You must never allow the comforting illusion of blood ties to permanently blind you to the terrifying reality of abuse or financial exploitation. When those closest to you consciously choose the path of deliberate cruelty and extreme malice, you must find the inner courage to completely cut the ties and walk away forever. You must stand firmly and unapologetically with the innocent victims regardless of the heavy personal cost. True legacy is not defined by the vast amount of money you inevitably leave behind when you pass away. True legacy is forever defined by the fragile and innocent lives you consciously choose to save from the encroaching darkness. I stood up from the rocking chair and walked slowly down the wooden steps to join my son by the water. I am a very proud father, and my true legacy is finally completely safe today. If my journey to protect the innocent resonated with you today, please hit the like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of truth and justice. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from and exactly what time it is there right now.